to Down Your Unders. Down Your Unders. Review and dissection of content from some of the sharpest minds in the game. Hosted by Adam Camilleri. Art of War. Down Under.
Hello, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to this episode 164 of the Art of War Down Under podcast. My name, as always, is Adam Camilleri, and I'm joined by the stats bird, the raptor of statistics, master of disaster, some other nonsense. His name's Peter the Falcon Colissimo, and you may remember him from being on this show for various reasons, most usually to update our faction ladder when it becomes time to, which we have not done for almost 30 freaking weeks, mate. Why is that? Why do you think we would have held off for so long, Peter?
Well, I am a really bad friend, and so every time you asked me at the end of 9th edition to do a final breakdown, I would say sure and then never respond to another message you put out again. So that was, I think, a big reason for a couple of those months. And then 10th edition started, and we kind of
there was no
had
point
to wait and see how that played out, and it wasn't super bueno. Anyway.
So the reason we're doing it now is because we want to capture the last pure snapshot of Index versus Index 40k for this edition prior to the first codexes coming out. We got the Tuners Codex that is probably going to be entering play this weekend for the first time, or maybe even next weekend more prolifically.
Yeah, I believe there was one event this last weekend, based on when we're recording, that got to use them. But yes, this will be the first weekend of actual Tyranid play, and actually the first weekend really for the new data slate
as well. Exactly right. Yeah. And so if people listening to this, that was the weekend just gone is the one we're referring to, because actually we're doing this prior to the weekend. So we're going to capture that snapshot of just the pure state of Index 10th edition, the shit show that it was.
Yeah, it was interesting.
That was the other reason we haven't done it so long. It's because there was no real change in game state. I was planning to do one if the last balance, the middle of Index Hammer balance, did anything notable, but it didn't change anything. So I didn't do one of these episodes. So we held off. Now we've had both codexes entered into the mix, and we've had a significant data slate to shake things up. So we'll be definitely, after answering Patreon questions, in part 2, we'll be pontificating upon what we think the faction ladder is going to look like for the coming next couple of months, which it's really exciting to discuss. I haven't been that enthusiastic about 10th edition. I've still played about 25 games of it. I'm still enjoying it, but I'm not like thriving, passionate, every free moment I'm looking at a list or a unit kind of stuff that I was, during some of the best points of 9th edition and 8th edition. Is that pretty much where you've been at this far as well, mate?
Yeah.
Yeah, it's pretty...
That is all I have to say.
Fair enough. Well, mate, I've already told you guys about part 2 where you can find it. It's over at Art of War Down Under over on Patreon. But Peter is a member of many a show and many an organization and a program and a thing and a stuff, and he should tell you all about them right now.
Sure. The big place I contribute these days is goonhammer.com. My old website, 40kstats.com, merged with Goonhammer forever ago now. So if you go to 40kstats.com or 40kstats.goonhammer.com, that's my baby. It's kind of been fully automated at this point, so I just get to look at the numbers and play with them rather than having to input them myself manually for hours on end, which is aces for me. I love it. And yeah, I write articles, either previewing new rules or expounding on the state of the G.I. Joe movie, like whatever tickles my fancy. So that's the main place. I will sometimes guest host on different podcasts. Recently, I was on Grim After Dark, which I'll do occasionally to help out Val and the crew there. Yeah, but like my main jam right now is goonhammer.com. I do a lot of stuff in the background there now, and then occasionally we'll either write articles or contribute articles for them.
Beautiful. You should all definitely go over there and continue to support Goonhammer and Peter in all he does. We would not be where we are with statistics and knowledge of the game without him, and hopefully you love and adore him as much as I do. But Jumping into this one, so this is a faction ladder a little bit different from some of the others you may see here, there, and all over the place in other podcasts and things. Especially, AOWdu just put out a faction ladder on their YouTube channel, and that one was them speaking about what they think the faction ladder is going to be like from a top player point of view, the best players in the world playing the factions to the best of their abilities. Ours is not that. We take the backwards approach. We use as much of pure statistical analysis as we can, all the data and all the bean counting that Peter can produce to put together purely based on win rate and a couple of other metrics to get our faction ladder. And then we look back at the months just gone and keep this thing updated throughout the entire edition. We were lucky enough, Peter, thank you very much, that we did 9 of those episodes for 9th edition. We have 9 stats episodes. That's 3 a year. Every 4 months we did a faction ladder update. Yeah. So it's funny enough, this is the 10th stats episode we've done in 164 episodes, and it's the first one of 10th edition, which is very ironic, and it tickles my giblets. So, my man, there are always some acronyms get thrown around when we're doing one of these, and always in the comments somewhere, people will ask, what does XYZ mean? Are you able to give us a little TLDR, the acronyms that will be used during this episode, and explain them to people so they have a little bit of understanding before we jump in?
So the main statistics that I have used to kind of track the quality of different factions and how they're performing over the years have been average first round loss, which is the average round at which a faction first loses a game in a tournament. That is a statistic that I have found over, thousands and thousands of games to really accurately kind of define how well a faction is performing in a meta. The next one is T-WIP or G-WIP, which are tournaments in winning position and games in winning position. These statistics mark out how many times a faction has gotten to at least 4-0 in a 5-round or greater tournament. Compared to the rest of the field. So I'll often talk about T-WIP percentage. And what that is like the percentage of times that a faction gets to that 4-0 record compared to every other faction in the game. Because most tournaments are 5 rounds. So getting to that 4th win, you are in almost guaranteed, unless you're in a weird European meta where they like to only do 5 rounds with 900 people. Where you are probably in that top 2 to 4. You're in the running to win if you get to 4-0. Games in winning position is a statistic that just adds on to that, specifically because we are now getting into a point where events are more and more frequently larger and larger and larger, and we're seeing more, not just 6-round events, but 7, 8, 9-round events. And so this actually takes a look at every game after counting that 4-0 game that a faction in total goes undefeated. So if you go 5-0, that counts as 2 games in winning position. If you would go 6-0, that would count as 3 for the faction that you're playing. And once again, we can break that down by percentage to say, the percent of games that go past 4-0 in tournament play for different factions are XXXX. And these are 2 of 2 to 3 of the I find the most accurate statistics out there to determine how well a faction is playing. Lastly, like GW and other websites or Reddit posts or whatever, I do also look at win rate. It holds a little lesser of a quality in terms of breaking things down, because in the past we have definitely seen factions with what we would consider very solid win rates that actually aren't winning events. And we've seen factions more often that have what we would consider mediocre win rates, but still putting up big win results in the past, in terms of actually winning events in the past.
So that's my biggest criticism of purely looking at win rate statistics, is that it never tells you the story. It doesn't answer any of the questions related to why things are the way they are. It just tells you a fact. But gives you none of the analysis. Just gives you none of the information. It's like literally being told, you're allowed to read the blurb of the novel and none of the novel. That's it.
Yeah, and another big thing about win percentages is like it is very heavily weighted on the amount of games you're actually playing, and things like that. And there's really there's none of that background, that nitty gritty, to really like flesh it out compared to other statistics.
We're big old fatty nerds. We love that nitty gritty. Well, that's what we're here for. But anyway, let us truck on, mate. The last time we did this was in the last months of 9th edition. And so usually I read out where we left off in our last faction ladder. But this one will pretty much be entirely new, with none of this being relevant, but I think I thought it'd be kind of cute. So in the D tier, and the way we're going to be doing this, guys, is we've broken down every faction in the game into 5 tiers. We've got D tier, C tier, B tier, A tier, and S tier. Now, from top to bottom there, S tier is something that we are considered to be the best faction or factions in the game. Usually there's only I think the most we've ever had is 5 factions in S tier, and usually it's between 1 and 3. And they're the factions that, if you play them, they are considered to be better than they should be. Like, they have things that they do that are too good based on the rest of the balance of the game. That could be, Eldar having, access to dev wounds at the wazoo for the last couple of months, and that made them S tier in addition to being phenomenally undercosted. A tier is a faction that is well-rounded and strong and has a good chance of hitting T-Whip with a good player and the right list and the right meta, etc. B tier is on a great day, really well-tuned faction expert. These are factions that can go the distance, but will usually not have tools to beat or come close to beating an equivalently skilled opponent on a S tier list. Whereas it's considered that on a chosen day with the right list, an A tier a faction with a good player can beat an S tier faction with a good player, whereas B tier is kind of not. C tier is you are in the doldrums, you have maybe one good list or one couple of things you can pull together to club it together, and then right place, right time, right list, you might hit T-Whip. And then D tier, you got nothing to bring to the table. Sorry, you are in squalor, and hopefully things turn around for you soon. Starting from our previous 9th edition ladder, just for the lulz, in D tier we had Imperial Fists, White Scars, Deathwatch, Admech, unfortunately that hasn't changed much, and T-Suns. So there are a couple there that have certainly jumped out of the D tier gates, and certainly a couple of these that we won't be tracking anymore as well. I don't expect us to be tracking White Scars and Imperial Fists on our current faction ladders because there isn't enough granularity in the codex to bother or warrant tracking those. So they're probably just all going to be Space Marines, right?
Yeah.
Fair. C tier is Raven Guard, Salamanders, Chaos Space Marines, Tyranids, Death Guard, Imperial Knights, Drukhari, Ultramarines, Necrons, Sisters, and Tau. So that is a lot of factions in the C tier at the end of the 9th edition. B tier, Renegade Knights, Harlequins, Blood Angels, Grey Knights, Black Templars, and Leagues of Votann. A tier was Custodes, Space Wolves, Orcs, Chaos Demons, World Eaters, and Astra Militarum. And then S tier comprised of Craftworld Eldar, Iron Hands, GSC, and Dark Angels. So that is going to be deleted. I'm going to delete that from my spreadsheet right now because that's the last time it is relevant, and we will not be speaking of 9th edition any further. Mate.
Hooray!
Yay! I mean, it was kind of nice at the end, but maybe we didn't know how good we had it because I was complaining about 9th edition at the end of 9th edition. I was just like, it's a bit stale. It's pretty boring.
Yeah.
But compared to where we are now, it was a good time. Right,
it was a great time.
Feel free to kick us off with the D tier factions.
Okay, let's talk about D tier. So coming into
Sorry to interrupt. I will reiterate for anybody at home, this is all the data prior to the Tyranids codex and the new balanced data slate being injected. So this is prior to all of that. So please keep that in mind. If things like, because we're about to talk about like Death Guard and stuff like that, and you may be like, well, but they got a bunch of new rules. This is before those kick in. Just for you.
And I'll do my best to try and highlight, yes, they look like they're going to be improving greatly. For the most part, I am using statistics from July 5th, which was when our first mini data slate came out, until September 13th. If occasionally I may refer to June data as well, because but the big thing here is there was a negligible impact on the game with that July 5th Leviathan 1.1 or Leviathan beta. It barely changed any factions, minuscule differences. So but since the beginning of 10th edition, and even from the preview season, we knew there were a couple factions that had been quote unquote done dirty. And the one that suffered the most, in my opinion, and it's a close battle for worst faction in the game, is Leagues of Votann. The last 2 months of play, they had an average first round loss of 1.39. They had a win rate of 31%. They had dropped down to being only a little over 1% of the field. It was not their time in the sun. Like, they, depending on the statistics that you look at, they were like 3 or 4 percentile lower than any other faction in terms of win rate alone. They struggled very hard.
I put Leagues of Votann in a similar kettle of fish to Knights and Harlequins, armies that have so few data sheets that they're either going to get rules that are too good or not good enough. A lot of the time, they're very hard to balance when they have so few units to put rules on to create depth. And so it just comes down to whether they have good enough stuff on release or they don't. There's really nothing more to see there. And unfortunately, you crack open the first couple of pages of the Leagues of Votann, index, where you look at the special rules, the attachment rules, stuff like that, and you're like, this isn't blowing me away. And as soon as it doesn't blow you away, you're like, well, they better have the best data sheets in the game then, and they don't. So it is what it is.
No, they had mediocre stratagems, a very bad faction ability, a detachment ability that honestly sucked, and it's very telling that how massive an improvement it was given in this current data slate to add an additional 3 starting units to get those 2 judgment tokens. It was very clear that they were just not anywhere near any other faction. The hits that they took to native ballistic skill were massive on all their data sheets. It was, and now we're going to be in a Sagittar world, I think, with everybody running 4 to 6 Sagittars at the minimum, and tons of Thunderkin.
Hearthguard is still the best thing they've got. So you're just going to Control C, Control V, Hearthguard. I
think 10, anywhere between 10 and 20 Hearthguard. You're going to be running max Thunderkin now because they're 75 points for 3. That's silly.
I think they're good.
Oh yeah, I think Votann are in a spot to, the next time we talk about this, be an A tier army, if not an S tier army, depending on how things break down. But I'm at least giving them a low A. I feel like they're very competitive now.
Awesome.
But right now, 31% win rate. They're not going anywhere.
Yeah, I'm a little bit more optimistic. I wouldn't be surprised if they hit the B to B plus area, but we will wait and see, mate. What's up next?
Death Guard. Death Guard kind of fought tooth and nail with Votann to be the worst faction in the game. Depending on what dates you're using, their win rate since the Leviathan launch is anywhere between 32 and 35%, because there was, I believe, an event overseas where Death Guard did actually pull off a victory, and few people played them because they knew they were bad, that just having 2 or 3 guys actually come out 4-1 added 3% to their win rate, because average first round loss of 1.3, a win rate of 32 to 35. It's nothing to be excited about. They were overcosted. They did nothing better than anybody else. Their detachment ability was very weak given the state of the game. Once again, it was, Death Guard launch was miserable. They didn't have a faction identity other than you painted them sickly green.
Well, when you looked at what they did, you couldn't figure out what their rules meant they were meant to do. They weren't quick, they weren't durable, they didn't do damage, they didn't have any rules. They were an army that just did not do anything, and it was so frustrating for a lot of my Death Guard mates who were just like, our faction doesn't exist. It literally has almost been deleted because there is no identity to the models that I have bought. And that, I suppose, that was the biggest indictment. You can have bad faction rules that are flavorful and they're bad, and you can live with it. But when you have none that don't, yeah. Anyway, this is absolutely setting fire to the already beaten dead horse. What's up next?
Next in D tier, World Eaters. A faction that definitely they really went hard in the identity of corn, should punch stuff.
Mhm.
But the game was very clear from the get-go that you shouldn't punch anything unless you were Custodes. There was really no faction in the game that could do close combat because of the nerfs to charge phase and fight phase and the reduction in AP. It's just like close combat armies just suffered greatly, and World Eaters
had nothing else
more than any of the others.
Well,
they have an average first round loss of 1.33, so basically the same as Death Guard. A win rate at least of 37% because there was the chance that they went first and killed more than one unit if they made it across the board. But yeah, nothing to write home about. They've never hit T-Whip.
Yeah.
None of these first three factions have ever had a 4-0 run since the July 5th launch. So,
well, it's just so amazing that World Eaters kind of, they do what they're meant to do. They are the opposite of Death Guard. They have phenomenal like flavorful rules, and not rules that unfortunately were that relevant in Index 10th edition because of the way it was played. Essentially in Index 10th edition, everybody could be shot because of how towering worked and how indirect worked, and then if you could be shot, you could be killed. And if you could not shoot back, that means you were just being killed. And there's no interplay. So it's not like World Eaters, I think, were a horrifically bad army, despite I think them being significantly overcosted at points. The fact is there's no other army in the game that had worse predators for what they were supposed to do. Like just the world was just anti-World Eaters by default. So anyway, what's next?
So next up, in the D tier, there's a couple factions here that have had at like one T-Whip showing in the last 3 months. They still have very poor win rates in the mid 30s. Sometimes, depending on the week you're looking at them, they could get to 40%, but they've never broken 40. And the first one I'll talk about is Sisters of Battle. So Sisters of Battle is this kind of cusp of, because of just the state of the game, this is our cusp of a C tier army at this point. They've hit T-Whip once. They have an average first round loss of 1.5. Just to give you guys some extra information on average first round loss, the average first round loss, if everything is equal, in a system where the majority of tournaments are 5 rounds, is going to be 2.05. So your quality factions, your balanced factions usually run somewhere between an average first round loss of 1.9, 1.85 to about a 2.1, 2.15. Anything higher than that is a problematic faction. Anything lower than that just isn't cutting the mustard. To be at a 1.5 is not a good place to be. And so Sisters of Battle at a 1.5, a win rate between 37.5 and 40%, depending on the week. They're not showing up. It's they're better than the first 3 guys I talked about, but only barely. So
still in D tier?
I'm going to keep them in D tier because I have a hard time calling any faction with a sub 40% win rate a C tier faction, but this is just fair. Where we were, right?
That's fair.
Next up, this is one where I think a really good player could make them do something.
Was this Admech?
In teams play? This is Grey Knights.
Ooh, nice. Still in D, or we moved over to C?
I think this is that same top of D.
Yeah.
So Grey Knights, they had an average first round loss of 1.47, very similar to Sisters. They have had the difference here is they did have one person go undefeated in the opening months of 10th edition. Their win rate hovers between a 36 and a 40%. But yeah, one time somebody went all the way and got that undefeated mark with Grey Knights. It's a very fast faction. They just can't kill anything. So you have to play the mission, and that's very hard for people to do, especially because there are certain armies that just play it significantly better and you have to dodge them.
Yeah, and there's that burden of perfection on you. Like you stuff up and you lose a 500-point unit.
Exactly.
There's not really coming back from that.
I will say, coming into this next balance data slate, like Grey Knights are my like dark horse potential super competitive faction that I'm not hearing a lot of people talk about, but they got so many points back on their most competitive lists that I could definitely see us start to see like more and more top tier Grey Knights lists come out of this.
Yeah,
because I think of most factions, they got the biggest points buff on their core like units. Like they're adding like 300 points to their lists
just based on points.
Time, so.
Yeah, they're possibly one of the biggest winners, if not the biggest.
So like that's going to be big for them. We'll have to see if it's enough, given that they're still not killing anything.
It's kind of absurd how much they don't kill. Anyway,
yeah.
Into the C tiers, I think.
At this point we can move into C. C tier, we've got Drukhari. They did have two people get into that, and this is like if someone were to say Grey Knights are better than Drukhari, in my opinion, you're right. I'm not going to fight you. But like just statistically they're slightly better. They've got that they've had two or three people hit that, or two people hit that T-whip instead of just the one. Average first round loss slightly higher. They've broken that 1.5. Their win rates they hover between a 38 and a 41%. Like that Dark Lance spam can do work sometimes. They're nowhere near a competitive faction, but they at least exist in somebody's mind somewhere, or did in the first 3 months of the game.
All right. Next up after Drukhari,
Tau.
Interesting. So wait, we still haven't mentioned Admech.
We still have not mentioned Admech, but we're getting surprised. There because I should. You know what? Just for you. We can put Admech here, but I think Admech are better than Tau. We just didn't even realize it. So I'm going to go with Tau.
Yeah, let's do it. All right.
We're doing it. So the big thing that with Tau, the Tau does have over Admech, and I think actually this is legitimately just because more people have been playing Tau, is like they have had 4 people hit T-Whip. They did have one undefeated run. Of those 4 people, they've got 6 games in winning position. Their average first round loss is 1.61, which is relatively respectable. Their win rate is, that 38, 39% most of the time. So they're still barely ever breaking 40. But they've just had a bit more success on the that T-Whip run and on that average first round loss. So I'd put Tau in the C tier slot right here.
Nice. Well, it's always weird because I always hear so many Tau experts and Tau fans pontificating and telling me how good Tau is. And I hear them and I listen to them and I look at the units that they push under my nose. I'm like, damn, these are actually really good. And then they just never seem to shape up in the meta because I think there's just a couple of too many predators. Firstly, their best units apart from broadsides had no defense against dev wounds. Then things out there like GSC and especially like T-Suns just turned off what they do. Like turning off armor saves on a full unit of crisis suits with a commander in there that's half your army and like 80% of your army's damage output, and then it gets nuked in one turn. Yikes abound. And that stuff hopefully doesn't happen anymore or as frequently. So we'll see.
Next up, I'm going to kind of bulk together 3 of the non-Codex compliant chapters. Dark Angels, Space Wolves, and Blood Angels. They all 3 had very similar statistics this early run. That 39 to 40% win rate, sometimes breaking a little bit higher week to week, depending on who was playing Dark Angels, because I believe Dark Angels had the most potential success, even though it didn't actually show up. They were also double the popularity of either Blood Angels or Space Wolves. That being said, Dark Angels players only ever had one undefeated run. They've only had one player actually hit T-Whip in these last 2 months per the data. Space Wolves had 2. Blood Angels had 2. But the average first round loss of roughly 1.6. So these 3 factions, C tier. I think mostly C tier because Marine players, like especially on the highly competitive side, will always flock to like the best version of power armor. And it was not any of these three, despite like Dark Angels definitely having an ability to stand up in the meta, in my opinion.
100%.
It's just nobody of a competitive caliber has been trying.
Well, yikes! I'll take that as a personal slap.
Yeah, well, I mean, what did you do? Did you hit T-Whip?
I haven't played an event.
Well, that's your fault then, man.
I haven't played an event with Dark Angels yet.
I mean, I'm happy because Dark Angels are a garbage faction, at least from a lore perspective. So
keep your trash on your own blog, mate. You're not.
Okay.
What's next?
Next up, let's do Guard. Guard, 41% win rate. They've had 3 people hit T-Whip before. Average first round loss of 1.6. Yeah, they're doing okay. You can definitely get enough indirect out there to possibly beat somebody more than once.
It's so amazing, though, that Guard was one of the most complained about and toxic elements of this edition of Index Hammer so far. And they were a, lower middle, if even that, if not a lower third faction, and they were complained about to high heaven. In the same breath that people could complain about GSC and Eldar, they would also complain about Guard. And yet Guard is just not even in the same ballpark. They're not even playing in the same stadium.
Not even close.
Yeah.
They're they've just been bad.
Yeah, well, the fact is they have one build. They have one build that's one archetype, and it does one thing. And if you are not susceptible to that one thing, lol, they're a doddle. They're not. Yeah.
Oh yeah, it's been. I've gotten to play a few games into Guard in this early edition, playing my Custodes, and I was always worried about the Earthshakers or the Basilisks hitting me and making me not move. But then I just won the I just went for, I definitely had more than one game where I went first, and 2 Blade champions were just like, well, I'm in your zone anyway, so it doesn't matter.
Yeah.
And then they have no response. And that's kind of like how it's been. Like we've seen some really good teams play out of Guard, but in one-on-one play, they're like a bottom table bully, and they can't do anything else. Like they're not even a mid-table bully.
Nah, yeah, exactly. Well, teams has shown that with like a good pairings matrix and a good person doing those pairings, they can be one of the most oppressive armies in the game.
For sure.
Like in the same realm as our S tier factions, they can be an S tier faction if you can just dodge probably 3 or 4 matchups exclusively. And then you can just be an absolute predator with the rest. So it is really surprising that even that power exists to the bottom spectrum of the tier list.
And next up, I'll give you your AdMech. So AdMech have a very similar win rate to Guard. The big difference is how very few people have played AdMech. We're in a spot where I would say, even though we've had 3 months worth of data, there almost isn't enough data for AdMech to get legitimate results. But yes, a 41% win rate. They have, though, of the 35 people that have tried to run AdMech in this post first data slate world before we got the actual good one, they did have 2 people hit T-Whip. And not only did they hit T-Whip, like they went deep, and one of them went undefeated. And because of that, their average first round loss is a 2. Like it's actually what someone would consider like relatively fine. It's just that win rate of 41%, the fact that they only make up decimal 9% of all the factions being played. Like they've fallen off the earth because the view has been that they're not competitive. Their detachment ability sucks balls. Like it sucks donkey balls. It's not fun to run. It's actually legitimately bad for them half the time. You up until now that they've had massive point drops, I'm excited to see what they do, but you really only could just run breachers and hope for the best. So yeah, I'm really excited to see where they come, because it's clear that there are some very good AdMech players, and a couple of them actually still managed to make it work in these first 3 months. And but yeah, I have them kind of firmly in the C tier, but given the like low amount of reps, you could argue that they shouldn't even be there just from that alone. That's where the numbers went.
So it's really surprising because now I've got so many questions about whys and whys and whys. Because this is what happens to me when I look at stats. I don't look at stats that much because I just get stuck in loops and like I need to know why things are. Because is that a statement on the AdMech player base that they have a higher percentile of faction experts that are stuck with the faction, whereas the people who have an AdMech army and a Marine army just aren't playing the AdMech?
So what I would say in this particular case is the data set is too small to make that argument.
Yeah.
To make those kind of conclusions. I will say, like, there are people out there that do exist that are very well known in the community that will stick with AdMech no matter what, like Rickard Nilsson, that kind of person who they don't ever switch.
Yeah.
And then if they go to a 28-person GT, they might be able to pull off a victory or at least get to the finals regardless, right? Just on their skill alone and their reps in the faction.
Fair. All right. Any more in the C tier after AdMech?
Yeah, I would say we should include usually in the past I would have broken out all of the different Space Marine like the Codex compliant Space Marine factions as well.
Yeah.
But in this case, I'm just going to ball them all up into one because with 10th edition, other than special characters, there really is no difference any longer.
Yeah, correct.
So I would say Space Marines are actually kind of at the top of the C tier, which is interesting because I think early on, and not just myself, but many people thought they were a potentially like very competitive faction. Yeah. Because Desolation Marines were so scary. Oath of Moment is a very powerful detachment ability. But unfortunately, as we've seen, despite their popularity, they get absolutely shit-wrecked by the top like 5 factions in the game.
Well, and so the thing is, when your army has only one good unit, which is Desolation Marines, and they have other good utility units, but there's only one build-around unit, and that is Desolators, or there was during this period of the game. We have discovered another in Aggressors, but it uses the same resources, and therefore they can't coexist. You can't have both. Yeah. And so therefore you have one A or S tier unit, and that is all you have. Apart from that, it is just clobbering together lone ops and infiltrators. That's kind of the rest of the list. When that is the archetype, it only functions for so long. When you only have one list, it only functions for so long before people figure it out and either figure out how to wield their best army to beat yours or change a percentile amount of what they're doing in their list and in their playstyle to account for what you do. And the fact is, there are so many armies that just didn't care about Desolators. Like Custodies, just unless you get the direct fire on them, they just didn't care about Desolators. Desolators weren't that good into mechanized units, especially when you were spamming things like armigers. You could only put Oath of Moment on one of them, or you took Gilliman, congrats too. And then only one of them was Bolter Discipline, so it wasn't even doing that much at times. So there was just a bunch of things, and you're even going to show us there are a bunch of freaking armies above them on the tier list that don't care about Desolators and about Desolator profiles. And I think you're about to reel off a bunch of them.
Yeah, well, particularly once we get into the A tier, but the A and the S tier, but even the B tier has a couple, so like they kind of topped out at a 42% win rate, and generally even kind of often week to week stood even lower into that 40th percentile, despite making up 6% of all the player base, which is nowadays not decently significant, which we come to expect from Space Marines. They only ever had 3 people hit T-Whip. They never had an undefeated run in these last couple of months. A 1.63 average first round loss. These are just kind of like piss poor results, and it shows. Like, they're definitely Space Marines, and I didn't mention them before because they generally don't see a lot of play, but Black Templar basically mimic regular Marines in all regards in terms of average first round loss, T-Whip, and win rates. They're also kind of in that C tier as well.
I'll chuck them in there as well.
I'm not going to say too much about Black Templar. They do have a small player base. That said, it's actually bigger than AdMech at this time, which is its own whole faction, right? So,
wild, yeah.
But yeah, that's the end of C tier. Black Templar and regular Space Marines kind of top out that C tier range.
All right, so there's only one other Space Marine sub-faction we haven't listed, right? So there's only Death Watch to go. We'll see where they end up, mate.
Well, yeah.
Kick it off.
They're good. So B tier, kicking off B tier, we have Chaos Knights. So Chaos Knights coming into 10th edition, it was kind of clear that they were like the slightly worse Imperial Knights.
Yep.
And it's shown like they've definitely had some decently competitive builds. They've had 4 people hit T-Whip in those past few months. Average first round loss generally between 1.65 and 1.7. So we're getting almost to the point where it's what I would consider like a at least competitive army, but not quite there. At a win rate that generally was, 45, 46%. It hovered in that range. And they only ever made up like 1.6% of T-Whip. So like a very solid B tier faction, Chaos Knights.
Easy done. What comes after?
Tyranids, pre-Codex Tyranids.
Interesting.
They had a pretty solid run. All things considered, they were still a very popular faction at 5% of the meta. They had 6 people hit T-Whip. 3 of them went undefeated in events, an average first round loss of 1.85, which I kind of already said in the past, kind of that cusp for me of this is potentially a legitimate faction. A win rate of 47.7%, topping out in that like 48% range. So we're kind of getting there type thing.
Excellent. It's weird to me that I feel like Tyranids was an army in Index Hammer that was only getting better with time. Like it
definitely was.
Yeah.
Like you definitely saw people starting to make like it was one of those few cases of adaptation. I liken it to back in 8th edition for anybody that played with Necrons, where just some very small changes caused Necrons to like they still never broke like a 47-48% win rate, but they started winning events because if they hit Space Marines, they dominated Space Marines, and there were so many Space Marines in that time that it gave them a run. And it's kind of the same with NIDs, where NID players were able to kind of build out to deal with factions like Thousand Suns and Genestealer cults.
Yep.
And as long as they could either dodge Eldar or play into like a very weak Eldar player in their run, they had a chance to be legitimate.
Yeah, agreed. All right, what comes next?
Orcs are basically like line for line the exact same stats as we saw with Tyranids, 47 to 48% win rate. I've got it here at 47.8. Average first round loss of 1.85. A smaller player base than Tyranids, but they still also had those 6 players hit T-Whip. They had 2 undefeated. Orcs solidly in there. That like horde style that we saw a lot of at WTC also translated very well into the meta because a lot of people were trying to tech into the bigger bads like Imperial Knights, Eldar, and Custodes, which don't generally run a ton of models. So
yep, correct.
You could push into the face and just survive right until the end of the game and win on points.
All right. Yeah. Honestly, Orcs was another one that I thought was getting better with time. And they had a lot of good... It's weird how we got a couple of factions here in Tyranids and Orcs that aren't really good into A tier, but actually have decent play into S tier factions. And it's really, really interesting how that occurs sometimes. Anyway, what comes after Orcs?
I think the last... I would say these last 2 are kind of our 2 last B tier, and you could make an argument that they were like borderline A tier factions. First off, Chaos Space Marines.
Yep.
They did hit T-Whip quite a bit. Actually, we should put demons first. Like if you're going to do them in order, I know you do like them in order, but these are very similar. So demons, similar to Orcs and Tyranids in that they did have 6 people hit T-Whip. The difference being is that those 6 people generally went longer. They had a G-Whip of 11 or almost 3% of the meta. They did have 2 people go undefeated. Their average first round loss is a 1.97, so just about a 2. And their win rate, pardon me, was at like a very respectable 49.7%, so almost a 50%.
Damn, yeah, that is pretty good. It's demons. I always just found really interesting in this meta because they were just like another knight army, yeah, but just asked the questions differently. If that makes sense.
Yep.
Yeah, really, really surprising.
And then Chaos Space Marines. And Chaos Space Marines, slightly lower win rate than Chaos Demons at like a 47.8. But an average first round loss roughly the same, 1.95. The big difference was their T-Whip. They did make up almost 5% of T-Whip in the game. They've had 13 people hit T-Whip. This is with similar faction representation to Demons. 21 games in winning position, 3 undefeated. In early testing of 10th edition for me, like just prior to the launch, Obliterators and Abaddon with Terminators scared the absolute bejesus out of me in my gameplay, and that definitely translated throughout these first 3 months as like, if that list hits the right people, it's just gonna win.
Well, people are saying now CSM is one of the ones to watch because with their 2 and some say 3 biggest predators removed from the game, are they just going to start having absolutely clubbing people with just damage output?
It is very interesting. They've definitely come up a little bit. They did take a slight hit with the Abaddon point increase. And with Obliterators not being able to overwatch outside of line of sight with that 1 time per game baloney. But still very relevant. I do think that they are a faction to watch. Like, I feel like they did, if it wasn't for the fact that one faction in particular is still so obviously dominant to me. We'll have to wait and see. Like, it's going to be very interesting. I'm like, in case you haven't noticed, anybody listening, I'm very excited for where the meta goes.
Me too,
because I think that even though I do think like one of the S tier factions is still very much the top dog, I feel like the A tier and the like upper B tier are so much wider now, and like it's a whole new ball game. Anyway, but yeah, I would top the B tier with Chaos Space Marines as like the top of the B. They could have been contenders. They were almost an A, but they didn't make it.
All right, into the A tier factions.
So the A tier factions are interesting in that I feel like a couple of them we would have considered S tier factions
in
a month ago.
Yeah.
Or even a month ago. I feel like the last month saw some pretty interesting changes to the meta in terms of adaptation and change. In this kind of rank, the low, what we would have probably considered S tier, or that like that A tier rank, the top end, the top 2 or 3 factions of the game never have been affected, but this area has seen some significant change. First off, Imperial Knights. So these were big, bad, scary at edition launch. They did see a pretty decent nerf, and we've now seen like extensive nerfs to the point where I think they're dead as a faction. But post Leviathan 1.1, they made up 7% of the player base. They had 14 players hit T-Whip. 5 people had gone undefeated. Their average first round loss broke 2.02, and that a win rate that broke 50%. So a 50.5 win rate. So very good numbers. Not the like 54s and 55s we were seeing at the very beginning of the edition. A lot of that was more the like TOs making decisions to impact Imperial Knights play in terms of terrain, I think, than anything else. But
taping up all the cracks, taping up all the upper story windows. WTC adoption of ruins and their terrain pack really did a lot to hamper.
And the FLG terrain as well had their pack where they modified towering, which is now what we're going to be using whole hog, which is great in my opinion. But yeah, Imperial Knights were kind of like the bottom of A tier by the end of this run.
Next up,
I would put Necrons as the next one up in the A tier. They jumped in popularity at the kind of tail end of this last like month, I would say. They went to almost 7% of the meta. They had 25 people hit T-Whip, 8 people going undefeated, an average first loss of 2.13, which is very solid.
Really
right?
Good.
and a win rate that broke that 51%, just like, that broke 51%, 51.12. So like a very solid performance on the Necron side. And I feel like they were only getting better as they kind of took over the role that we saw, in my opinion, like they were slowly gaining on the losses that we saw in Imperial Knights and the Adeptus Custodes.
Yeah.
Who we're about to talk about.
All right, let's put them in. Custodes
I'm putting up next, and that's only because like their early run and the cause of their nerfs was very good. Like they did have 15 people hit T-Whip. They did have 3 people go undefeated in that like the last 2 months. We did see in that first big GOW Open the finalists were both Custodes players, which I don't think people fully expected. Average first round loss of 2.08. Their win rate is a 52, and they made up 9% of the meta. So listening to those statistics, if you're really paying attention, it does sound like Necrons were outperforming them. What I'm adding to this that I would not normally do, but it's very important, I think, when talking about these things, is when you look at like the casual side, Custodes go ballistic, and they end up jumping up to like a 58, 59, like 60% win rate at times. If you follow the Tabletop Battles app data, which is another thing I also will look at, Custodes are a very binary army. So the like mid to bottom tables and the Garage Hammer games, Custodes were absolutely hammering people. The thing was that Meat Mountain build, which had been doing very well, did have some very important counters, and we started seeing more and more of those hit play. It kind of felt like Custodes needed to branch out into, instead of going 3 or 4 big blocks, to be 6, 7, 8 small blocks to be more effective, and try to just play the mission game instead of trying to kill things. But even then they struggle into Eldar and some other factions. So like they really started to drop it. In that last month, they didn't have a single tournament win. I don't even think they hit T-Whip in the final month of play. And then they saw some pretty significant nerfs in this balanced data slate. Like maybe arguably more than any of the other factions, just because of the change to, not counting Imperial Knights. Never mind. They got murdered. But then the Custodes, the change to dev wounds is massive for them, on top of point increases and 100%. Unit size increases or decreases and everything else. But yeah, Custodes also A tier. And then kind of the next one, I wouldn't say it's the last, is Thousand Suns, the Eldar with extra steps.
Yeah. Eldar with terms and conditions.
Eldar with terms and conditions. They made up 5% of the meta. They still had 16 players hit T-Whip. 5 people go undefeated. The average first round loss 2.22. Which in previous years or previous edition or episodes, I would have said was definitely like a low S tier faction. Only a 51% win rate most of the time. Sometimes you'd see them break 52, 53, but averaged about a 51, because like there was a lot of extra skill to them that you had to be able to play through. So the top end was very competitive and definitely a scary faction to play against, but you hit those bottom table Thousand Suns and it was a whole different story. Thousand Suns nerfs in this latest balanced data slate, I will say, were the ones that surprised me the most, but also the ones I was the most grateful for. Because it was one of those things where when GW was explaining their process and they were saying, effectively were saying we only really look at win rates. It got me a little nervous because I was like, I know so many very good Thousand Suns players that are just absolutely wrecking people with these lists. So to see them, make the changes I believe were necessary without outright killing them either, I think Thousand Suns are still a very competitive army as long as you stop looking so hard at Scarab Occult Terminators. I feel like they're there. But yeah, so that's A tier, Thousand Suns. And then
there's only one more, I think.
And this one could be an S tier. They just don't have a lot of play rate is the problem. And that's why I'm going to keep them down in A, and that's Death Watch. Deathwatch definitely were the best of the Marine factions by like a good margin. They had a detachment ability and enhancements and stratagems that were definitely stronger than everybody else. They saw pretty significant nerfs even before, like even as their index launched, because of a couple of their abilities. But still, despite only making up 2% of the meta, they had 10 people hit T-Whip. It's very similar numbers to what we saw with Imperial Knights and some other factions that had like quadruple their play. Of those, they only ever had one person go undefeated, but their average first round loss was a 2.2, and their win rate hovered between 53 and 55%. Most of the time, I've got them at a 53.3. If you kind of adjust to the like 20-person events, which I usually only hold to 28s, they get bumped up to like a 54. Deathwatch definitely like kind of that top of the A tier, just nobody playing them because it's a very hard army. A lot of people want to kit bash them as best they can. So they get a little less of the conversion rate that we see, easy conversion rate that we see with the other Marine factions when they're on top.
Perfectly said. And I think the A tier is a really interesting microcosm of what's going to happen post balance slate because they all got hit in some ways, some backhanded hits, some meta hits, and then there's a couple in here who are just, I believe, going to come out looking like superstars. Yes. But it's the hits GW did to the A tier that are the ones that really surprised me and impressed me. Because I agree. They're the ones that showed the foresight. They showed that they were thinking about, hey, what happens when we hit these two that we need to hit? What takes over from there? And it showed that they actually thought about it because legitimately, if they did nothing to Custodes and they took away Eldar and or Necrons, and if they did nothing to Knights and took away Eldar and GSC, like, wow, it's revolting. They was a big one.
Something I said, I think I tweeted it out, was that this was, in my opinion, from like heavily tracking GW and what they've been doing for the last, what are we now, like 5, 6 years, 7 years, whenever 8th edition dropped.
Yeah, that's 7.
So in like those 7 years, like early 8th edition, they were like rapid fire with FAQs, and then they slowed everything down because I would say this is the best balanced data slate or like big FAQ in terms of comprehensiveness that we've ever had. It's not perfect, but I feel like it was the most well thought out.
There's a couple, so they did the top end extremely well. The bottom end, I think they could have done a little bit better. But regardless, let's wrap this thing up, and then we can talk about the whole thing as a block. So we got 2 more factions.
Our S tier.
No one's going to be surprised. Nobody's on the edge of their seat in wonderment.
So let us S tier is Gene Stealer cults. They jumped up to almost 5% of the meta, which is the highest they've been in a long time. A 60% win rate. 35 players hit T-Whip, 14 undefeateds, an average first round loss of 2.79, which is massive. It's huge in most metas other than like the most oppressive metas of our last 5-6 years of play. 2.79 would be by far the best faction in the game. Outside of like Iron Hands play or Harlequins and Tyranids in 9th, like 2.79 is outrageous. Unfortunately for our poor Gene Circle boys, this has been like the quarter of Eldari. Their 10th edition index was nerfed multiple times before it even saw release. There were nerfs done to it that people don't even know existed, that were incredible, and they still came out ridiculously strong, and they've maintained that. And one of my few complaints about the balanced data slate was that they definitely didn't get hit enough, but I understand that they don't want to go too brutal on them. The Eldari stats, they had 379 players, 78 of them hit T-Whip, 35 undefeateds, an average first round loss of 2.92.
So can you say those first 2 numbers again? Did you just tell me that if you just played Eldari, you had a 10% chance of hitting T-Whip? If you were just a player who plays Eldari? 300 something
it's
players. What?
They had 370 players and 78 of them hit T-Whip. It's like 17. It's almost 20% of Eldar players
hit T-Whip.
It's like 18 or 19% of Eldar players hit T-Whip. It's like 1 in 5.
Everybody?
Basically.
Yuck. Sorry, continue.
Yeah. Average first round loss of 2.92. I've only seen that broken a couple of times, and generally for much briefer windows than 3 months. Like Raven Guard at the end of 8th edition, Iron Hands, of course, was the kind of big bad at the end of 8th that had several runs in that like 3.0 range. And then Tyranids and Harlequins in 9th. Basically nobody else gets those numbers. So they've definitely been oppressive. They made up 10% of all T-Whip period. Sorry, I lied to you. 30% of all T-Whip period. I was looking at the wrong number.
God.
35% of games in winning position. So not only are they getting there, they're going the distance far more than any other faction, and they had jumped up to being 10.5% of the meta. So like even with being the most popular faction in the game since the launch, because they were so good, so like mind-numbingly boring, they still had a T-Whip ratio, so the amount of people hitting T-Whip to the amount of people playing the faction of like 2.93, like almost a 3. Same with Gene Stealer cults. It's just absurd stuff. And if you look deeper, I know there's been a lot of people throwing out all sorts of Eldari numbers. You can go to the guys at StatCheck have some like ridiculous intense Eldari data. We've seen Goonhammer release articles on it. Is it the most oppressive thing we've ever seen? Arguably no, but it's close.
Yeah,
and,
it joins.
It's not a good way to start an edition.
It joins like a very elite few that you reeled off before, so it makes at least in the 5 most oppressive armies of all time. And you reeled off the other 2. Well, since we've been in the what I call the modern era of the game, which is since 8th edition. They're in the top 5 worst, and you can debate till the cows come home about what order those top 5 are in, but I don't care. They all suck. Let's never see them again.
It was all bad.
I would like to talk about a moment about the distribution of factions, because this is something I always like to look back about how many factions inhabit each tier of the faction ladder, and it kind of gives me a cue or a clue of the health of the game. So we have 26 factions that have been tracked by yourself, mate. And as we reel from the bottom, we have 5 factions in D tier, 9 factions in C tier, 5 in B, 5 in A, 2 in S. Apart from the C tier, that's relatively healthy. Like, that is not horrifically bad on those metrics. And pretty much what you like to see and what I like to see is the majority of factions distributed between C, B, and A, right?
Usually I like to see them B to A.
Yeah.
And the thing I would say about this in particular, a lot of those C tier factions in a previous world, I would have argued were D tier factions, but the D tier was so bad and there was so big that they kind of bumped them into another range just by that fact. Because a lot of several of those C tier factions barely have ever broken even a 40% win rate, like 30th percentile win rates, just to go back in the history of this game, because they've happened before. Like I clearly remember in 8th edition when I would do commentary on statistics, there only ever being 2 factions below 40%. For very long periods of time, sometimes 3. It would be like Grey Knights, Blood Angels, and sometimes Tyranids down there, depending on codexes. And that would generally be it. And then everybody else would be at least 40 to 45. We've got, 10, 12 or something odd factions that are below a 40% win rate. But like the top end is so good and the bottom end is so bad that it kind of just bumped them up in terms of rate.
The other thing I want to highlight is that we could almost, for one of the first times I think ever, there could almost be an S plus tier to actually tell you just how much better Eldari is than GSC. Is that correct? Yeah.
Oh yeah.
It's almost like there's S plus, then S, then A. It's really quite crazy just how much better the A tier is than the rest. of the armies in the game, maybe with the exception of right player, right list, orcs and nids, and CSM. But
Yep.
apart from that, the A tier is just so much freaking better than everybody else. It's kind of absurd as well. We could almost put another tier of just emptiness between the A and the B tier, which is pretty revolting.
Yeah, I agree. We definitely played like a tiered system of 40k for the last little bit.
Yeah, this the hads and have-nots is what we've been calling it, and it has been pretty apt. But to give you guys the full rundown before we wrap this one up, and thank you very much, Peter, for your incredible insights and statistical knowledge, from the bottom to the top in the D tier, the worst faction statistically of 10th edition Index Hammer was Leagues of Votann. In second last place was Death Guard. Then we have World Eaters, Sisters, and Grey Knights making up the 5 factions in our D tier. C tier comprises of Drukhari, Tau, Dark Angels, Space Wolves, Blood Angels, Guard, Admech, Black Templars, and Astartes, making for 9 factions in the C tier. B tier is Chaos Knights, Tyranids, Orcs, Demons, and Chaos Space Marines. There's 5 of them there. A tier is Imperial Knights, Necrons, Custodies, T-Suns, and Deathwatch, another 5, and then GSC and Eldari up in the S tier, being just the 2. So if you were to cut this thing in half, we would have like 2/3 of the factions in the B minus to D tier. And then we've got Demons, CSM, and from the Bs making it up into the As and with the As and the S's. It's like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 out of 26 factions probably make it into, we can win a GT on a given day, and which is how we usually break this down. And then the rest is like, pray you don't have to play Eldar twice,
Exactly. Which at 10% of the meta, you're almost guaranteed to do.
Exactly, so. Man. Especially playing 8 and 9 rounders, you're just gonna have to run that gauntlet. In spite of that, we got a lot to discuss in part 2, so we're not going to hang around too much longer because we're running a bit long on time for what we've got for this recording slot. But my man, how are you feeling about the stats that you've gathered? How many games did you have tracked and that you were pulling for from this? Like, what was your sample size of the Index Hammer?
So for Index Hammer, my sample size was I just closed everything down.
I'm sorry, bring it back up. I'm sorry.
Hey, dude, it's fine. Life is like a box of chocolates.
He's biding time, guys. He's treading water. You can hear it.
I'm treading water while I look while I reopen everything. Let's see. We're looking at, where's that total button? We're looking at looks like about 36,000 games.
Yeah,
that we're tracking here for this. So
pretty healthy.
It's a good amount. Like there's been a lot of talk that things have kind of been dying down, and that there's a lot less interest in the game at the top level right now, and I'm not sure that's completely accurate. I would say, like, at the utmost level, yes, just from a purely anecdotal way of looking at things, which I hate doing. I do have a good amount of friends that were getting pretty sick and tired of the current way of 40K, but they hadn't quite hit their limit yet. So.
Yeah, well, that's exactly the same as me. I know. So everybody was grumbling about how much they weren't enjoying it and going to events anyway. And that's more of a testament to how much people enjoy our community and enjoy hanging out with their mates and rolling dice regardless of the meta. So that is a good thing that we just said there.
I'll be honest. I was having a blast for a couple of months there, even with I was playing my Custodies. I was playing my Blood Angels. I was really enjoying my Custodies until I kind of got really into Meat Mountain, and then only some of my games were enjoyable for both people, depending on who I was playing against. But yeah, so I'm very excited right now. I'm getting reps in with my Votann. I've been getting reps in with some other factions, and the game seems to be in a slightly better spot than it was before, and I'm very excited to see where it goes.
Me too, mate. And on that note, we will wrap this one up. Please go and check out all that beautiful stats goodness over at Goonhammer. What's the website? Goonhammer.stats? Or is it /stats?
Goonhammer.com, or you can go to 40kstats.com or 40kstats.goonhammer.com. to get all that data.
And if you would like to get the second part of this one, which is going to be the lovely Peter and I answering your stats-based questions in our Patreon, and also we're gonna put ourselves to the test and try and predict what the next one's going to look like.
Good for that.
see where we're at. We will talk about where we think factions are going to end up post data slate. And I'm not going to open up the Art of War faction ladder right now and look at that before we do this, just so I'm not a total fool. Definitely, I'm not doing that. I'm not doing it. Never mind. But anyway, we will see you on the other side, and if not, see you next week. And thank you for your support. Say there it is. There. Good night.
Thank you for listening to Art of War Down Under, a content review podcast for Warhammer 40K, hosted by Adam Camilleri, produced by Seamus Ronan. Enjoyed the show? Want your lists reviewed and the content you heard put into practice? Sign up to our Patreon and connect with us online or on Facebook. Just search for Art of War Down Under. Signing out from tomorrow.